Well, hello, Endow ladies. Simone here, Director of Program Growth for Endow. And I am so happy to start this new year, 2024, with Noelle Mering. Noelle, welcome to the Endow Podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.
I am so happy to have you on. I've been wanting to interview you for so long, and I'm such an admirer of your work, as I'm sure many of our listeners are. But if you don't know Noelle, you will soon become a listener, a fan of hers. She is a fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center. She's author of the book Awake, Not Woke and the Theology of Home book series, and also editor of theologyofhome.com. So I'm a subscriber of theologyofhome.com, and I'm so grateful to all of your work there, Noelle.
Well, thanks for being a subscriber. I love hearing that. That's great.
Yes, I'm always happy when I get those email newsletters, keeping me in the loop of the important things going on in the church and the world. So with the podcast series this year, with our special guest this year, we're going to have three very specific conversations that have to do with the Endow Apostolate and the Endow movement. So for those of our listeners who are new, Endow is a Catholic women's apostolate, and we call women together to study important documents of the Catholic Church. So when I asked Noelle to be a guest on the show, and I was happy she agreed, the document that she chose is a document we actually haven't talked about yet on the podcast, which is John Paul II's post-synodal apostolic exhortation from 1981, Familiaris Consortio. So Noelle, I want to start the conversation off by asking you, why did you choose this document?
Yeah, no, it's a great document. I think in some ways I chose it because I really like thinking about the context of when he was writing it. So I think the synod had been going on for a few years previously. So late 70s, obviously they're turning to these important questions, fundamental questions about men, women, children, family, life. And I think it's in this context that's really interesting to me because, so the second wave sexual revolution is really roaring in the 60s. And it feels, sort of very maybe utopian, but then turns quickly violent. And the 70s, it seems like, the sexual revolution is just kind of becoming normalized. And there's a lot of upheaval. You get Roe versus Wade, a whole host of sort of very kind of propaganda type feminist messages throughout the culture, popular culture. And then John Paul II produces this important document. And that backdrop to me is very striking because it feels like the church is very pastorally, but also with no fear of proclaiming the truth, actually being a shepherd to a world that is kind of on the cusp of very different ways of understanding very fundamental things. And so I think for that reason alone, it's compelling to me. But I also really, I obviously love John Paul II. I love how balanced it feels. I think that he speaks very beautifully about womanhood and marriage that is, I think, really avoiding any pitfall of drawing any sort of caricature on one way or another. So he speaks, as he does in other places, about the dignity of work that includes dignity of work for women, that women can be, in public spaces and making vital, important contributions to society. That is in the public sphere, but that it is always that recognition of that important reality can never be something that is compromising of the depth and dignity of the role of a woman in the home. And so I think in that way, I really appreciate the way he speaks about both there, where it doesn't seem like we have to fall into sort of an old dichotomy or false dichotomy, I think. That I think has been presented to us by either, a sort of secular feminism or a kind of very stringent understanding of womanhood that we see in other, maybe more fringy aspects of Christianity. And so I think he really led the way, I think, in finding that sort of richer understanding of womanhood and spoke about it as such. And I think it resonates with so many of us, and including me at a younger age when I first read it. Just that it, as a new mother, I remember thinking, It's so interesting how much I've brought caricatures into my own, like been projecting characters into my own life. And the reality is really different, that the reality of a loving marriage and the reality of navigating, being at home with with young babies, which I did for when everyone was young for years and years and years. That, that those are just considerations that should be made out of love and cooperation and, willing the good of the common small community of your domestic church. They're not considerations that should be informed by what's going to give me vainglory or what's going to make my husband feel like, I don't know, whatever dynamic is sort of imposed on you from maybe some sort of stereotypes. They're really, I think most couples that love each other and have goodwill and intelligence can navigate those, all those realities out of great love and service. And so I think Pope John Paul II really modeled that, I think, in the way that he wrote about all of those dynamics that avoided any of those pitfalls and also avoided those kind of cartoons.
Yeah. And just for the benefit of our listeners, Familiaris Consortio translates to the fellowship of the family. So this is a document primarily on the family, which it's a post-synodal exhortation. So this means that there was a synod to discuss this very subject, the things that you're addressing. And the subtitle is on the role of the Christian family in the modern world. So, I was thinking as you were speaking, Noelle, that how dramatic it must have been for John Paul II, who we can all say was very much concerned about a contraceptive mentality, really taking over the church and the world, understanding that, as he said, as the family goes, so too the world goes. So if we don't have strong marriages and families, we don't have a strong society, a strong culture. So these are very important things to meditate on. And I appreciate so much what you said about the temptation that you had to kind of project these caricatures on yourself as a woman who is, both, like you said, like at home, changing diapers with the kids, but then also, as we all see, very productive in the world of work and outside the home. But that the home life, it seems to me, is the foundation and the basis and that mini civilization of love that really fuels fruitful work outside of the home, so to speak.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And I mean, one of the things I have to tell younger moms is that, there's seasons in motherhood, that it feels like at the beginning that this is just my life forever. And, but kids grow up so quickly, and it's such a cliche, but it is really a bittersweet one.
Yeah.
We now have flown the coop to college and beyond now. So, and 3 still at home, but it really goes by in a blink of an eye. And I'm so glad that I kind of allowed myself to have, that consolidated good time with them. And then kind of pivoted into more career type stuff later, as it just sort of kind of came up organically in my life, which I'm so grateful for. But it is always a balance. There's a way in which, there's a lot of ways that we can kind of feel fed, I think, in our work and the career, especially if it's a bit more public, that we have to be constantly checking, that's there's a temptation there too. And then all of a sudden, maybe doing the laundry looks a lot less glamorous than going to give a talk or something, So, I think that's why the church is always inviting us to self-examine and to have spiritual direction, if that's available to us, regular confession, so that we can be course correcting as we navigate all of these very different spheres of life.
Yeah. And I love what you said about, it just, in a unit that's based off love, like it is an open conversation. I think one of the most exciting and interesting things to me about marriage and family is that each family has its obviously 2 unrepeatable, unique beings that are coming together to create this little domestic church. And that's going to look different than any other family, but there's like a creative collaboration between the spouses and the children that it can only be its own thing. So, and so you, like you said, there are seasons, and you can also look around and get spiritual direction and help. But at the end of the day, it's a dialogue that you have with each other and with the Lord, and what works for your family. And I really appreciate as a Catholic and as a Christian that the creative part is left up to us, right? If we're living in Christian freedom, apart from that, it's up to the Holy Spirit to kind of weave our unique personal vocations within the context of the family. So I have two more questions to you before we conclude this short podcast. We're going to do a series of 3 short podcasts with Noelle, and that's kind of the structure we're going to take for this year with our guests this year in 2024. Is, the concept of freedom. I think the view of marriage today is so low, right? That marriage is something that is that restricts your freedom. You kind of lose yourself when you get married and have children. I mean, it's such a negative culture when it comes to marriage and family. How would you respond to that as someone who has a very positive experience of those things?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's unavoidable sort of that we kind of have those struggles because it's so much in the air that we breathe. That sort of shift of how we approach marriage. And I think it is reflective on, in some ways, how we view God, right? Like we can either view God as being sort of this oppressive, authoritarian being who is restricting our freedom by placing all these strictures on how we behave, or maybe I think oftentimes people, maybe in the secular world, will say, you look at it and say, oh, there's so many limitations on your abilities to be, maybe sexually liberated or what have you, or contracepting it. Or we can understand God to be working in harmony with who we are as daughters and sons, right? That we are created by him and that he has nothing other than our true fulfillment in heart, in mind. And that is utterly integrated with the idea that we have an author who we are made from and made by and also made for. And so, these aren't restrictions on our freedom. They're actually ways of helping us to live in harmony with our very human nature that can most fully free us. So I think that that's similar to how we approach marriage, and that, I think it's been reframed as being something that limits our freedom for a similar reason that God is, I think, reframed in that way, because it's a rejection of the idea of service. The servium, and that everything's been replaced with a metric of power. How am I empowered? How do I get power? Who is taking power away from me? And we'll never see the beauty of family and life and marriage if we have that framework, right? Because it's a framework really of a lie. Yeah. And it starts a new reality, which is, that a covenant of love, where the service is the greatest way we can evaluate our own actions. And so I think having that sense of service, and it's hard because certainly there are cases where it can be abused, that there can be unhealthy dynamics in some marriages where maybe someone is service oriented and someone is domineering, and, and that can be for man or woman. And so, there's all sorts of very human, natural ways that we have to work through our individual circumstances and get help outside if we need help, and all of that. I'm not trying to create a Pollyanna-ish view of marriage, but I do think that there's a real mistake in absorbing this filter of power and then trying to think that we're going to see and find the beauty of marriage and family with that wrong filter.
Yeah, I love what you said there about a framework of a lie, and it is a framework of a lie. And we can argue theology, philosophy, we can bring out papal documents and so forth, but really the data just speaks for itself. We are a miserable, unhappy culture, a culture that has confused freedom with license. So we don't even need to have any theological arguments about it. The data speaks for itself. We're unhappy and depressed and lonely. So, maybe we should do what you were suggesting, which is kind of going back and what obviously the Pope is operating out of, which is a respect for human nature. Maybe the culture embraces a contraceptive mentality at large, but like human nature cannot change whatever happens, whether it's second or third wave, feminist movement or not. So right. You mentioned seasons. I want to conclude by asking you, who should read this document? Who would you recommend it to?
I mean, I find it to be utterly relevant before I got married, I was a young mom, but also now. And one of the things that I was surprised and reminded by that hadn't been as striking to me earlier in family life, but is very striking to me now, maybe because of the evolutions in the cultures, the emphasis, the beautiful emphasis he puts on the role of education for the parents, how much that is in the parents' prerogative and how that cannot be compromised without compromising justice. And certainly I think that given all of the things that are happening now in the education system, taking away parental rights, his words are very striking in that way. It was almost prophetically kind of, it's like he was anticipating that this could go down a very dangerous road if we abdicate that kind of role and responsibility that parents have to kind of direct that education, and how formative it is for kids to be educated towards the truth and the beauty and the good. And if we kind of siphon that off as being in the domain of something utterly secular, and then we can kind of band-aid on some spiritual life onto that, then, you know, we're missing a whole richness I think education should be oriented towards. And so I think that whole section struck me anew upon this more recent reading.
I love that. And it's a matter of justice in terms of having a good education. This is something that the human person truly, I think, deserves, we could say. To live a happy, flourishing life, and that cannot happen without education. Well, thank you so much for recording this short podcast. I hope many of you go ahead. We're going to go ahead and link up the document Familiaris Consortio to this podcast. We will also link all of Noelle's initiatives and books. And for those of you that do not have time to print a magisterial document from Vatican.va and want to have it all set up for you, the same issues or the same topics, that are discussed in Familiaris Consortio are also discussed in Humanae Vitae, of course, in a different way, Pope Paul VI document. So we have an Endow study all set up for those of you who are ready to talk about these things in a small group community, an 8 to 12 week study, Humanae Vitae. And, you know, Noelle, when I taught high school theology, I really wish I had the Endow study on Humanae Vitae for my students. I mean, I know it's designed for, Endow women to study in small group communities, but gosh, it's a great study. And I wish I had it when I taught high school. I would have definitely used it as a high school teacher. So thank you for
Cool.
joining me, Noelle, and we'll talk again soon.
Thanks.